What if Herman's Hermits were Kinks copyists? This week we'll be taking a little look at the Manchester band who may now not be remembered as one of the leading lights of the British invasion, but who had transatlantic chart success that would have been the envy of many of their contemporaries. I'll also be honing in briefly on the Kinks' ferocious early sound, the furious power chord attack that arguably helped to launch both punk and heavy metal. All that and more on this week's What If, How and Why. Hi, my name is Morgan Brown, and every Monday I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel. And then on Wednesdays follow it with one of these companion videos where I discuss the artists and genres involved in the What If video, and also share a little bit of my creative process. The idea of the What If videos is that each week I pick a popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of the song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I have around the house in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week was No Milk Today by Herman's Hermits. I tried to reimagine that in the style of the early Kinks. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. I said in my intro, and I do think it's probably true, that Herman's Hermits these days are not one of the best remembered bands of that 1960s British invasion wave of bands. When you look at that time period, I mean, obviously the likes of the Beatles, the Stones, the Kinks, the Who are in a whole different league, but even bands who you'd think were closer to their level, like the likes of the Hollies and the Searchers, I'd argue that they have more recognition these days than Herman's Hermits do. But when you actually look back at Herman's Hermits' career at the time, you realise that they were absolutely massive. I mean, very successful in the UK, but for a time even more successful in the States, to the point that they're featured in 3 Hollywood films, actually starred in 2 of them, and a massive run of big chart hits. Started off fairly typically for any British beat group at the time, formed in 1963 from the members of a couple of different Manchester bands. Had a few lineup changes in their early years, but eventually arrived at a stable lineup fronted by the then very young Peter Noone, who prior to breaking into music had been a child actor. He'd appeared in Coronation Street, the popular British soap, and whose babyface charm was going to be a major catalyst for the band's success. And the other major catalyst for their success, of course, was their association with Mickey Most, who would become their producer and would go on to produce hundreds and hundreds of pop hits throughout the rest of the 60s and then into the glam rock era and beyond. As a group, they weren't really songwriters, but that was fairly par for the course at the time, certainly before more bands started following the Beatles' example of writing their own material. So their first big hit came with a cover of the Goffin and King song I'm Into Something Good, which, in an eerie foreshadowing of this week's theme, knocked You Really Got Me by the Kinks off the #1 spot in the UK. It's kind of typical of the British pop sound at the time, but definitely on the cutesier, more lightweight end. You're very far removed from the Kinks there. It's very palatable, a bit sugary, nothing remotely dangerous or threatening about it at all. And that sort of set the tone for their entire career, really, which was generally focused on lightweight pop songs, and increasingly as they went along, edging a little bit more into sort of light entertainment, music hall, vaudeville territory as well. You get things like Mrs. Brown, You've Got a Lovely Daughter, I'm Henry VIII, I Am, Leaning on a Lamppost, proper old George Formby songs, reimagined in a slightly more 60s pop style, which really suited Peter Noone's cheeky, chappy style, but yeah, never threatened to make them sound in any way edgy or cool. So I guess as the 60s go on and there's a growing divide between pop and rock bands going for harder sounds and more into direction, and pop bands sticking to lighter sounds and a more singles focused outlook. The Hermits were very much on the pop side of things, with the focus increasingly being on Peter Noone rather than the band as a whole. And along the way, during this period, they did end up playing some interesting material, and I include No Milk Today in that, really. It's a song written by Graham Gouldman, who later had massive success, obviously, with 10cc, but who wrote a bunch of great pop songs in the 60s, including Bus Stop for the Hollies. And it's very much in the similar vein to Bus Stop. It's this sort of kitchen sink romantic drama kind of thing. I always felt the Hollies would probably have carried it off a little better. I think it was originally written with with them in mind, and I think they've got a bit more of that sort of epic sweep to their sound, which would have really suited the despair of the lyric of No Milk Today, whereas, as I say, with Herman's Hermits, everything always ends up sounding a little bit rinky-dink. But nevertheless, it's a great song, and I do enjoy the Herman's Hermits original recording. It's got that kind of perfect 1966 Baroque pop sort of arrangement to it, which is very pleasing. And around the same time, they also, in another foreshadowing of this week's video, recorded a cover of Dandy by the Kinks, which I think was a B-side in the UK, but was actually a hit single over in the States, which is an interesting choice for them. I guess it was picked because, again, it leans a bit into that slightly cheeky music hall style that they were increasingly cultivating. It's weird to listen to when you're really used to the Kinks version, because I think what makes the Kinks version so great is that it's got a real undercurrent of sleaze and desperation to it, which is underlined by Dave Davies' great spiky guitar, whereas that sleaze is completely absent from the Herman's Hermits version. It's all just very innocent sounding, maybe a little kind of cheeky wink, but definitely nothing you'd call sleazy about it at all. It all sounds extremely chirpy and happy, which is not really the vibe I ever got from that song when the Kinks were performing it. But that's just who they were, and there was no point in them trying to do anything else. It was very successful for them. As I say, they were racking up hits, particularly in the States. I think started out in films with a guest appearance in a Connie Francis musical, but then ended up being the stars of 2 more film musicals, which I've not seen, sadly, but I did read some synopses of them. They sound absolutely ridiculous, so I'm going to have to search them out at some point. Eventually the hits do dry up in the States. They carry on for a couple more years in the UK. As I say, Peter Noon's increasingly becoming the focus to the point that the group starts to be billed as Peter Noon and Herman's Hermits. By Noon's account, at this stage, him and Mickey Most had started making Herman's Hermits records on their own without even bothering to invite the rest of the band to the sessions. They just call in some session musicians and cut the record and not even include the rest of the band, which must have been horrible. So eventually, and inevitably, he splits from the group and embarks on a solo career, which, given his success as the frontman of the band, actually didn't really do that much in terms of chart success, and the rest of the Hermits tried to carry on with a succession of different lead singers. Made a couple more records, which, from the bits I've heard, move quite markedly away from the mainstream pop thing and start to try and introduce bits of more rootsy rock and Americana. You can tell that these poor musicians have been itching to do something a bit more like that and have been denied that opportunity by the Peter Noon and Mickey Most combo, but no more real success as a recording act at all. But in one form or another, they've managed to keep the Herman's Hermits name alive all the way through since then. There's only been one original member for quite some time now, which is Barry Whitwam, the drummer, and I think occasionally Peter Noon's had a bit of a grumble and tried to launch some legal proceedings to stop him from using the name, but yeah, he's still there, just kind of keeping the legacy going, and I'm sure they probably still pack people in, because as I say, even though they're not necessarily the most celebrated band of the 60s now, they've got so many hits, and I'm sure it's probably still a pretty entertaining evening out. But yeah, as I say, it's funny that their career did in a couple of places intersect with that of the Kinks in those early years, because sonically, in most respects, they're very far apart, certainly in the Kinks' early years. And the Kinks are an absolutely wonderful band, one of my favourites, and they're probably a band that I will use as the main subject of one of these, so I'm not going to discuss their entire history in detail, except to say that they had a remarkable career, going from being an essential singles band with this perfect run of high energy early hits through recording an incomparable string of some of the most perfect albums of the 60s into the early 70s, and then reinventing themselves as this touring workhorse and finding new success in America in the later 70s and into the 80s. And all of their eras are worth a really good look, because outside the stuff that's commonly widely known, there's so much more that's worth checking out. So I'm sure I'll end up doing a deeper dive into them on this channel at a later date, but just for now, all I really wanted to talk about was that early sound, which is what I was trying to recreate this week, because it's impossible, I think, in this day and age to quite imagine what it must have been like in 1964 to hear You Really Got Me coming out of some speakers for the first time. People often like to refer to it as, oh, it's the first heavy metal song or it's the first punk song, and I don't know if that's necessarily helpful. It's obviously a very important stepping stone towards both of those things and establishes some of the stylistic points that will later be mainstays of both of those genres, but it's not either heavy metal or punk, really. What it is, however, is definitely a massive step up in terms of toughness and aggression in rock music. The way the song's structured around this brutal, simplistic riff with just power chords, the root and the octave and the fifth of the chord rather than full chords, and then the way Dave Dave Davies attacks it, it's like nothing else really. I gather the song was originally intended to be a much softer, more sultry, bluesy kind of number, and I'm sure I read somewhere that Ray Davies played it to the band as a slower blues number and suggested that the riff be played by a saxophone or something, but then Dave was like, nah, and just started hammering it out on the guitar instead and transformed it into what it became. Transforming the riff into power chords was a great step, and then the actual sound, the fabled sound that Dave Davies achieved on that, by his own account, by slitting the speakers on his amplifier to make it distort. It's wonderfully ugly. It's not like the warm kind of valve distortion that Sister Rosetta Tharpe got from cranking up her little valve amp. It's ugly. It sounds kind of like something's broken, and that's what makes it so great and so raw. And then everything else just falls beautifully into line with that. Ray Davies, who's capable of a great range of expression as a singer, really brings out his snottiest side for it. And the rhythm section's terrific too. Mick Avery of the Kinks was a fantastic drummer, but I do gather on a bunch of those early singles, Shel Talmy, the producer, chose to use a session player. I think there were a couple of different session players who appear on those early Kinks singles, and I don't know why, but whoever he got into to do the job definitely got the assignment, because although I'm sure these players would have been seasoned jazz pros, they don't try and finesse anything. It's just raw, pounding energy, which is exactly what the song demanded. There's also the persistent rumour that Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin played the guitar solo, which has been utterly dismissed many times by both the band and by Jimmy Page himself. He just played rhythm guitar on a few of their early tracks instead of Ray, which I think is where the confusion must have occurred, but it's definitely Dave on the solo, which is a fantastic solo. All his early guitar solos, there's no thought of trying to play the blues authentically or of melody or finesse. It's just an all-out attack. So that set the template, and a bunch of those early singles follow approximately in that formula, All Day and All the Night, Till the End of the Day, and it's almost impossible to overestimate the influence that that sound had, really. Obviously, within a very short space of time, their more sophisticated side comes out. Obviously, Ray Davies developed very rapidly as a songwriter, so you get that dry observational wit coming in to a lot of his songs, which is wonderful. Things start to get a lot more melodic. You get that occasional vaudeville edge in, which in some respects nudges them sonically closer to Herman's Hermits, although they were always a much spikier, more dangerous proposition, even at their most vaudeville. And that development gradually leads to great albums like Something Else by the Kinks of the Village Green Preservation Society, and so on and so forth. But even if they'd never made that development, that early run of singles is so perfect that their vital place in rock history would have been completely assured. Anyway, that takes me up to this week's alternative universe scenario. So in my alternate timeline this week, it's 1966, and we arrive at Herman's Hermits at a point where they're doing tremendously well. They've had a lot of chart success, riding high on both sides of the Atlantic. Everything seems to be going great, but dissension is growing in the ranks. Although Mickey Most and Peter Noone are very happy with how everything's going, the rest of the band members are starting to feel like they don't have much say in anything. They're not too happy playing these novelty songs, and they really just want to rock a little bit. Derek Leckenby, the lead guitarist, has been a big fan of that early Kinks sound ever since the Hermits knocked You Really Got Me off the top of the charts, and so he suggests one day when they're in a band meeting, if we were looking for new material to record, why don't we record a Ray Davies song? Thinking, oh, that'll give us something a bit tougher to play. To his surprise, Peter Noone agrees, so they turn up to the next session, but the song they've picked is Dandy, which doesn't really scratch that hard rocking itch. It ends up being another chirpy vaudeville number, and that's not really what he was trying for. So his frustration keeps going and eventually boils over when they're in the recording session for No Mill Today. They've already worked out the arrangement. Derek has been given this nice baroque sounding guitar intro to play, so Mickey Most starts recording. Instead of playing the intro they've agreed, he just launches into this big Dave Davies inspired power chord riff, and the rest of the band, picking up on that energy, pile in after him and just play a much more forceful, aggressive version of the song than they'd ever entertained before. Mickey Most at the control desk is completely astonished by this, but recognising that he's hearing lightning in a bottle, just keeps the tape rolling. And when it's done, he has to concede that it's the most exciting thing he's ever heard Herman's Hermits record. So it comes out as a single, and their teen fan base is initially a bit stunned by this sudden change of direction from the band, but in the long run it helps establish them with a tougher sound that helps them into the harder rocking album album-focused era of the later 60s, and for generations to come after that, they become celebrated as pioneers of hard rock. So, in attempting to convert No Mill Today into an early Kinks style number, my first step as ever is just getting an isolated vocal, dropping it into GarageBand and syncing up to the grid. It's not a very cleanly isolated vocal, as is often the case with older recordings. There's no sort of studio separated vocal, so it's done with a stem separator and it's pretty messy. But drop that into GarageBand. There's a lot of repeats in the original record, which sound fine on that, but I didn't want my track to outstay its welcome, didn't want it going around so much, so chopped out a few sections and reassembled it into a shorter track. Next step was popping some drums on, so just going for that early Kinks feel, so nothing fancy, hard hitting, rocking drums with a little bit of a swing to them. Played it in by hand on my mini keyboard, just to get that very human kind of looseness to things. Used the most vintage sounding kit I could find on GarageBand, and then also added some overdrive in post-production just to make it sound like it was driving the desk a bit hard and just edging into a little bit of distortion around the edges, which I thought sounded pretty cool. Added some bass next, went for a good sort of woolly, rich, warm 60s bass sound, so rolled off the treble on my bass, not too much treble on the amp either, quite a lot of gain, so it's just quite fat. Didn't try and do anything too clever, just stuck to the riff, kept it glued pretty tightly to the drums just to make a solid, hard-hitting rhythm section. Guitars came next. I ended up using 3 guitar tracks. So I popped an electric rhythm guitar on first, tried to just give it as much of that Dave Davies tone as possible. I achieved that with, I think it's a Vox AC30 amp sim with the gain cranked high, most of the bass rolled off, all the treble on. It still sounded a little bit tame, so I added an EQ pedal in front of it, pushing the treble and upper mids even more just to get as much of that spikiness coming through as I possibly could. And then just to create a bit more of that vintage recording sound, added some post-production overdrive again and also a bit of vintage room reverb to it too, which I think made it sound pretty Kinksy. For the other rhythm guitar on the other side, put on a bunch of those early Kinks records. Ray Davies actually plays his rhythm guitar on an acoustic rather than another electric, which just creates a really nice texture, I think, behind that very spiky Dave Davies sound. So I used an acoustic guitar for that. Both parts just playing this power chordy sort of riff that I came up with on the verses, and then fuller chords on the other sections just to fill out the sound a bit more. And then for the lead guitar, I've got a solo there and also a bit more lead guitar that comes in over the outro. I tried to capture a bit of that early Dave Davies playing style, really frantic attack, not worrying too much about note choice, just grabbing handfuls of strings and hammering the hell out of them. Sound-wise, again, I think it was a Vox AC30 simulator. For this one, just to give it a bit of extra edge, I also added a fuzz pedal in front of it. Obviously, you really got me, I think, slightly before fuzz pedals were widespread, but by just rolling the level off a bit, I managed to make it sound a bit more like just that sort of slightly broken amp tone that you love on those early Kinks records. And then there were just a couple of other bits that I needed to finish the track off. Those early Kinks records tend to have a bit of percussion on them, just bolstering that beat. And quite often that's quite prominent in the mix because Mick Avery wasn't allowed to play his drums. They gave him a tambourine instead, so he made damn sure you could hear the tambourine. So I've got a tambourine and some shakers on there just to reinforce that strong rhythmic element of it. And then because, as I say, the vocals weren't isolated very well at all, although Peter Noon's vocal came through all right, the backing vocals were very, very sketchy and some of them have vanished completely, so I had to fill in those, and I thought while I was doing that I might as well add some more slightly Kinksy sounding oohs and ahs in different sections too. So I added, I think, 4 vocals, so it's actually just 2 lines but doubled, and they're just there filling the sound out. I didn't mix them too high because my singing's dreadful. And then mix the whole thing down into strict mono for that really compressed, mushy sound, and hopefully it came out sounding a bit at least along the lines of those early Kinks records. Then for the video, started as ever by trying to find some good performance footage of Herman's Hermits doing the song back in the day. In order to get good shots of Peter Noon doing all the different bits of vocal, I ended up using 2 performances, one from Beat Club and one from another European show, I can't remember what. Slightly annoyingly, because one of them was live and one of them was a lip sync. They're in 2 different tempos, so it was quite a fiddle syncing them both up to my track, but I got there in the end. Then, to make it feel more Kinksy, I added in some footage of just the Kinks instruments, because Herman's Hermits stage performances are very staid. I'm kind of matching the music. They're very restrained, standing very still, so I wanted a bit of that Kinksy energy. So I particularly used quite a lot of clips of Dave Davies playing All Day and All of the Night, and you can just see that energy. I think it really adds to the performance side of things. And then just to try and signal the kind of hysteria that I felt this performance deserved to elicit from crowds, I borrowed a bunch of footage of screaming fans from assorted Beatles concerts and edited that into. So I hope you enjoyed this one. I've always just loved the song and I wanted to do something with it. And it's tremendously enjoyable trying to recreate that early Kinks sound, which, as I'm sure I've made clear, I think is one of the greatest sounds ever captured on tape. So hopefully it came off okay. Let me know what you think down in the comments, and if you did enjoy it, please like, share, subscribe. The algorithm's been hitting me pretty hard recently, so anything you can do to boost the channel will be greatly appreciated. If there's anything you'd like me to do in coming weeks and months, any artists, songs or genres you'd like me to investigate, do let me know. Your suggestions are always really welcome. Otherwise, that's all from me for this week, so thanks very much indeed for watching, and I will hope to see you next time.